We're now going to shift to our first panel. That panel is focused on getting to a national recreation area. So I'm going to encourage the three panelists to start coming up here, and I'll keep talking as they're coming up to the stage. Our panelists are going to share perspectives that kind of start in the 1940s and 1950s through the 70s, really focused on the men who were involved in creation of the national recreation area, including congressional delegations from governors of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, spanning some time. They're going to talk about how the act happened, why and by whom. Full speaker bios are in your program, and I encourage you to look at those. So I'm not going to go into the details, but I will tell you the arc of our panel. First, you'll hear from Dr. Karl Brooks. Among many hats, he's the author of Public Power, Private Dams, he's showing it to you, the Hells Canyon High Water Controversy, and he's also former staff to Senator Church. Karl will describe what he terms the first and second controversy in the canyon. Then we'll hear from Mr. Mike Fields, who spent 13 years working for Senator McClure and was on the Northwest Power Planning Council. And then we'll turn to Mr. Rod Grammer, a longtime Idaho statesman journalist and editor and author of Fighting the Odds, a book about Senator Church. Rod will talk about bipartisanship and relationships in Congress and across governor's offices. And they are all in order, which is fantastic. And so we will turn to Karl first. Each will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes. We'll go through all three. And then please be writing your questions on those cards that are on the center of your table.
Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to be back at home in Boise. I'm from this town. First college teaching job I had was just around the corner, teaching a history class on a Saturday morning, which kind of got me spurred into the idea of jumping the fence out of lawyering and becoming a real professor. As I listened to Joseph's talk, I thought, my qualifications are pretty limited. I live in Kansas, which has no public lands, no wild and scenic rivers, no anadromous fish, and hardly any of the original native people who lived in that massive stretch of the Great Plains, most of them having been moved to Oklahoma or places further west. And yet, I think I have something to contribute to this talk because I literally did write a book about Hells Canyon. The controversy that I'm going to argue to you led to the creation of the Natural Recreation Area, the NRA. So I'm going to make 3 points here today. The first is that there were actually 2 Hells Canyon controversies. The first big one starts right at the end of World War II and ends when Idaho Power wins the legal right to build its 3-dam complex. Construction starts in 1958. Almost immediately, the first controversy triggers and births the second controversy, which results in the NRA. And I'll share how many of the issues that were uppermost in the first controversy recur again and again, but in really different ways because of the way the first controversy was resolved. Next point I want to make is that both of these controversies demonstrate a basic principle that I think Joseph really made well, and that is the natural world is always at the table. When we make these decisions about rivers, about lands, about communities as big and thriving as Boise, nature has a voice at the table, as it did during the controversies. Third point I want to make, and this is where I start handing off to the political experts, things have changed a lot between these controversies. You'll see that the political alignments in the 40s and 50s, even into the early 60s, in some ways have been reversed in our part of the Northwest. Also, the styles of leadership and the work that it took to build consensus for the NRA is a chasm apart from where politics are here today. And I'm going to leave it to my panelists to suggest some ways that we might redress that. So, point 1. 2 controversies. First controversy involves the struggle to build what the United States considered to be the world's largest dam in Hells Canyon. It would have been called High Hells Canyon Dam. As soon as World War II ends, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers start trying to drive the New Deal public power enterprise, think Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville, into the Snake Basin. Their plan is to build a dam that would have been taller than Hoover and control more water than Grand Coulee. One of their big supporters is pictured here at the dam site, Hells Bell. First District Representative Gracie Post, Idaho's first woman in Congress. Gracie was from North Idaho. she passionately supported the high dam, as did every Democrat in the state. It was an article of faith among New Deal Democrats that big dams were good for the working person and good for the Northwest. And Hell's Bell said proudly the night she was elected, I'm going to go to D.C. and I'm going to give them hell until we get this dam. With her is the director of the Bureau of Reclamation for the Northwest, as well as Congressman Wayne Aspinall, who turns out to be the chair of the committee that would have authorized the dam. So that controversy just boils on from the mid-40s through the late 1950s. At the time that it's going on, the alignments are really unusual. Things change a lot. In 1952, when Dwight Eisenhower is elected, this is how big the first controversy was over the high dam. Dwight Eisenhower gets nominated to run on the Republican ticket August 1952. He's the most well-known and popular man in the world. Where does he launch his presidential campaign? Boise, Idaho, on the steps of the Capitol. He draws the largest crowd ever gathered in the state of Idaho. Over 25,000 people gather to hear the great general. Why does he come to Boise? To talk against High Hells Canyon. He wanted to warn America and warn Northwesterners against this socialistic enterprise that would fasten big government on the Snake Basin. That's how important Hells Canyon's controversy was. It was a nationwide debate about the legacy of the New Deal, big dams, cheap hydropower, sacrificing salmon for the public good. And Eisenhower won a stupendous victory, including all three of the Northwestern states, which at the time were pretty darn Republican. He had 10 governors with him on the steps. 10 of the 11 Western governors in 1952 were Republicans. You can see how politics have changed in that time. All of these people fighting about a big dam were fighting about something that all of us in this room and everybody listening around the country to this work with all the time, and that is the natural world affects political decisions that we make. We may think we're designing solutions. We may think that we're designing compromises. Sure, we're doing that. But the natural features and forces that created the canyon, that pushed rivers through it, that brought fish into it and up into the further reaches, those are affecting the decisions we make continuously and constantly, and they will for as long as we have a future that none of us can really envision. That's one of the points of environmental history, is to study political controversies or economic development or social change with the idea that nature has a voice at all of the tables where we're sitting. So I want to step forward just a little bit into, that's a Gracie post again, Hell's Bell, with Al Ullman, the congressman from Eastern Oregon for nearly 35 years. Mike and Rod, I'm sure, will share with you that Al Ullman probably was one of the key architects of the NRA. He was at that time the chairman of the most powerful committee in the House of Representatives. He also underwent a big change. From big dam supporter to concluding in the late 60s that the economic future of his part of Oregon had to do more with recreation and tourism than it did with big power dams. So by the middle of the 1960s, the first controversy is resolved. Idaho Power has won a license to build what become its three-dam complex. The next controversy is already underway. Downriver forces, typically from Oregon and Washington, want another large dam. The names were various: Nez Perce, China Gardens, High Mountain Sheep. That's the one that gets approved in 1965 by the Federal Power Commission, in part because still Northwestern Democrats like young Senator Frank Church and older Senator Warren Magnuson there in that picture are still committed to New Deal principles. Big dams are good for the region, good for people, good for Democrats. In a pretty short span of time after that picture was taken in 1966, Senator Church and then Senator Jordan conclude that there needs to be a pause in dam building. Part of that comes because of the resolution of the High Mountain Sheep controversy. The Supreme Court ends up taking on the license case for what it would have been High Mountain Sheep, and completely changes the way that federal courts start looking at dams versus fish versus water versus native people legal arguments. In the early 50s, when Hell's Canyon first controversy is being resolved, The only test for the public interest was hydroelectricity and economics. By now, William O. Douglas writes an opinion for the Supreme Court in 1967 saying the public interest should consider whether a river running and fish swimming deserve to be considered as fairly in the eyes of the law as economics and politics. That's a huge change. And in part, that change is brought about by a lawyer from Boise, Bruce Bowler, who is one of the first environmentalists. Bruce's son Bert is sitting over here. I wrote a whole book, and there's a chapter about the environmental law invented in places like Boise, Idaho, and the Clearwater Basin by lawyers like Bruce Bowler. Those are the arguments that persuade the Supreme Court to change up the way it thinks about making environmental decisions. So much after that, the way the law we work with now reflects some of the pioneering work that these guys did, these hook and billet conservationists. One point I want to finish off with, though, and I'm glad Joseph opened this. In both of those controversies, both the first one over the High Dam and the second one that results in the NRA, for the most part, tribal concerns, fishery concerns voiced by Native people were largely ignored. There was some attention paid to the Nez Perce specifically in the negotiations over the NRA. In the first controversy, Indians were not only asked their views, when they asked about intervening in the legal case, the United States Department of Interior said, no, we're not going to represent you. You will not be heard in this controversy. It was a controversy that white people fought about the Nez Perce ancestral homelands. You can see how far we have come in making decisions about natural resources that Joseph and the people for whom he works have a voice at the table today. I guess my basic point going away from here is those silver power lines you see coming over the hills between Bogus Basin and here, those come up out of Hell's Canyon. Those were built when I was a kid here in Boise. But none of us really thought about where they originated in the canyon or what the controversy was that led to them coming across the Boise front. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who comes back to Boise and sees what this community has become, there is no doubt in my mind that the Hell's Canyon controversy and its resolution fundamentally changed the economics, the society, and the culture of this community, as the New Deal did the culture, the economy, and the society of the downriver states. Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, Everett, they wouldn't look like they did without those big New Deal dams. Again, the natural world always shapes the things that we think are ours alone to work on. I look forward to any questions you guys have afterward. It's an amazing history in a hell of a place, which is what I told a guy once on a plane when he asked, what are you writing about? And I got about 2 sentences into it. He was from Chicago, and he said, you lost me when you said Oregon-Idaho border. So thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. I look forward to visiting with you guys throughout the day. Thanks.
One of the things I enjoyed most about the senator, the way he got his staff to work to try to solve them in our state. And it was something I always enjoyed doing, especially when I was first. So I'm going to tell you a little about the senator. I think I'm probably one of the last living staff members, so that's how I got this assignment. But anyway, you'll know that public speaking is not my things necessarily. So I'm going to talk about the senator, and I know his son Ken McClure is over here on the right, who I greatly respect as well, and this man shaped my life in lots of ways, and so I owe a great deal to him. From 1961 to 1966, Jim McClure was a member of the Idaho State Senate. In '66, McClure ran for the U.S. House of Representatives for the Idaho's 1st Congressional District and won. He was reelected in 1968 and 1970. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1972 when Landry Jordan retired. He won 2 additional Senate seats in 78 and 89 and 84, and then he retired in 1992. Jim McClure and Cecil Andrus served together in the Idaho State Senate during the years 1963 to 1966. They both represented rural counties, McClure from Fayette County and Andrus from Clearwater County. That was the start of their relationship working across the aisle for the people of the state of Idaho. I don't remember Senator McClure and Governor Andrus not working together on public land issues. They had different styles, but they respected each other. That doesn't mean they always agreed, but they both could work together to resolve issues that affected Idaho. And during Senator Andrus's term as Secretary of the Interior on matters that faced the nation. My wife Debbie worked for Senator McClure in Washington, D.C. when Cecil Andrus was selected by the newly elected President Jimmy Carter to be the Interior Secretary. Debbie remembers the McClures inviting Cecil and his wife Karl to their home in Northern Virginia, along with the entire McClure staff for a welcome to D.C. dinner for the Andruses. And that's kind of the relationship they had. Senator Church and Senator McClure served in the Congress during the years 1967 to 1980. Both Governor Andrus and Senator McClure were advocates for multiple use of the public lands and were more commonly aligned with the interests of the state, of the rural interests of the state than Senator Church was. But they all worked together for the Idaho's best interest. It would be interesting to talk to all three of these elected officials today, Governor Andrus, Senator Church, Senator McClure, about the special places we as Idahoans now treasure and that they helped to create. I can't talk from personal experience about the particulars of the creation of the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area, but I can speak to how Senator McClure approached dealing with natural resource issues. Senator McClure was committed to all the multiple uses on the federal lands in Idaho. McClure, included in those were timber, grazing, mining, recreation, hunting, fishing, and wilderness designations. He was also a fiscal conservative who would have factored the costs of factored in the associated costs with those uses. I never attended a town hall meeting with the senator. I didn't have him talk about his ever rising concern for national debt, for helping federal spending, helping to keep federal spending in check. 60.1% of Idaho's land mass is controlled by the federal government. So it's easy to see why multiple use of federal lands is such an important issue in our state. There are many of our citizens that derive their income from responsible use of the public lands in Idaho, from the tourist industry to the timber industry, with the ranchers and the miners in the mix too. As I look back over the last 50 years of Idaho's use of federal lands, I sometimes wonder if we have gone right. Would we have the forest and range fires we currently have if we work to provide better management of our renewable resource, public land resources? That said, let me tell you about the Senator McClure I knew and worked for. First of all, he was a very unassuming man. He was not as interested in who got the credit for things as he was that the problem was resolved, and in the best interest of the state. I have heard others refer to him as the senator. What that meant was that he did his homework and generally stayed out of the limelight. He would study the issue, so he understood both sides of the argument and could share the good and the bad about issues as he represented it, as he legislated with his fellow senators and people of the state of Idaho. I found him to be crazy smart, a very talented man intellectually. I really enjoyed the time I was able to travel with him to meetings around the 2nd Congressional District. We would be heading to a meeting and we'd spend some time talking about the issues he was going to address. He would engage you in this friendly debate to see how much he knew about the issue. And then he'd start taking the opposite side of whatever you were telling him. By the time you got to the meeting, you weren't sure where he was coming down on the issue. But often you would hear some of the same thoughts you had presented to him come out of his mouth. Then you knew you'd done your homework. He just wanted to make sure he didn't miss anything concerning the issue. He had a great sense of humor. He loved to tease, especially his wife. You could tell he enjoyed helping others. His approach to any issue was balanced and thoughtful. He took his constituents' concerns seriously, and that was the approach he took in working with everybody. Now let's talk a bit about the process the senator would follow when working on public land issues and others. First, a concern would be brought to him by a constituent, either in DC or in a local office in Idaho. It might involve an individual, a community, or a business association or organization. It doesn't matter if it was a private or public concern, he went about it in the same way. He would listen to the concerns of the individuals and the entity. Then he would ask questions to make sure he understood the problem. He would then work with individual industry and would help them identify who in the federal government they were working with and who they needed to be working with. He would usually use his staff to engage with whoever the federal entity was, whether that be in DC or the state, listen to what their concerns were and find out what regulations they were using to support their position on the issue and get their recommendations. After having
listened to all sides to understand where they stood on any given issue. He would bring the sides together to listen to one another, generally with major issues that involved a federal agency and competing interests. He would identify the common ground first, then he would engage with them in ways to overcome the remaining obstacles. Not all issues could or would be resolved, but generally both or all sides of the conflict went away understanding the issue better, and it opened up communications for them to continue to work on unresolved conflicts, even without his assistance. That said, it only worked when the individuals or organizations came together with the frame of mind to come to a solution. If their self-interest was their only acceptable outcome, then the process didn't work. But at least they had the opportunity to state their case with those that were responsible on the federal side to make a final decision. We frequently worked with other members of the congressional delegation, staff, and members to resolve these issues. Senator McClure was a collaborator, and he expected the staff to also collaborate with other delegation, staff members, legislators, county and city officials in resolving issues brought to his attention. Again, he was less concerned about who got the credit than how to resolve the conflict. I didn't work on the Hells Canyon Recreation Area. I didn't join Senator McClure's staff permanently until the summer of 1975. Hells Canyon was in the 1st Congressional District and would have been handled out of the Boise and Lewiston offices. But I did have the opportunity to assist McClure and work with other McClure staff in Boise and DC on issues coming out of the creation of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area in 1972 and the Central Idaho Wilderness Area in 1980. After these areas were established, there were still concerns to be resolved in the restricted areas. DC and state staff worked hand in hand on all these major pieces of legislation. Senator McClure's chief of staff, Jim Galler, was based in Boise. He coordinated the work between both the DC and the state staff. Senator McClure knew the state well and was always personally involved in legislative matters such as Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. What are some of the projects I worked on using these same principles? In 1977, the Teton Dam disaster. It was the first time the federal government ever took responsibility for a federal cause calamity. Cleanup issues associated with the establishment of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. The farm crisis of the late 70s and early 80s, working on with small farmers across southern Idaho with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Lower Creek Dam flood control. It was the first time the Corps of Engineers ever fought a flood before the flood occurred. That happened in Ketchikan County. The Chalice National Stewardship Project in the 1980s, resolving conflicts between Forest Service permittees, loggers, miners, ranchers, and environmental groups. And a small one, but an important one, the Johnny Sack Cabin Preservation at the head of Big Springs in the Targhee National Forest. It was small, but it was important to locals, and we worked very hard to get that issue resolved. I want to thank all of you for the time today, but most of all, I just want you to understand how much I admired this great man and how much I admired the way he worked with other people. And we're going to pass the mic over here to Rod, and he can tell us more about Senator Church.
Thank you, Mike. I had the privilege as a reporter and editor of really covering Senator Frank Church, then writing a book about him. But I also covered Governor Andrus, and both when he was governor and interior secretary. Then I also had the privilege of covering Senator McClure when he was a U.S. Senator. When I was editorial page editor in Statesman, where Rocky used to work, I think we were one of the very few institutions that actually endorsed the 1988 Andrus McClure wilderness attempt, which they, I think, both described as a buzzsaw that they were kind of eaten alive by their respective constituents. Today, I would like to talk about my job is to talk about how did the Hells Canyon Recreation Area get created in 1975. There are 3 points I'd like to make in my remarks. The first is the recreation area would have never been created without the visionary and bipartisan leadership of politicians and leaders in the 3 Northwest states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Second point is that even more important than bipartisanship was the deep and abiding relationships that these political leaders had in these three states. And my third point is that should another major cross-border issue occur today, it would be very, very difficult to reinvent the bipartisanship and the deep relationships that were formed 50 years ago to get the Hells Canyon Agreement formed. So, as Karl said, by the late 1960s, there was increased pressure from the power interests to build an additional dam in the canyon to generate electricity. On the other side were environmentalists who were pressing Congress to preserve the last free-flowing section of the Middle Snake River through the canyon. In 1968, and Emily touched on this, Democratic Senator Frank Church and Republican Senator Lynn Jordan agreed to a long moratorium on construction of a dam in that stretch of the river. They did so for very, very different reasons. Jordan believed that over the years, there would be greater demand for power, and that would help streamline the approval of a dam in Hells Canyon. Frank Church, on the other hand, believed that over the next 10 years, the demand for recreation use in that section of the river for jet boating, rafting, hiking, and other uses would be in greater demand. Both thought that time was on their side. At first, the environmentalists supported the moratorium that Senator Church and Senator Jordan were trying to get through Congress. But as they had more and more difficulty getting that moratorium approved, they got frustrated and they went to Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon and asked him for support in preserving the canyon. Packwood agreed and got some very powerful support from a Republican House member, John Saylor of Pennsylvania. Thus, we had these two competing ideas, these two competing pieces of legislation to address the future of the canyon. Church and Packwood had the same goal, but different means to protect the canyon. And Church feared that Packwood's legislation would jeopardize the canyon even more than preserve it. And he also believed that he had a commitment to support the moratorium as long as Senator Jordan was in office. Senator Jordan and Senator Church had a very positive relationship, despite coming from two different parties. Jordan, who was also served as Idaho's governor in the early 50s, was incensed that his fellow Republican, Packwood, was making an end run around his moratorium. And he labeled Packwood's bill the, quote, the Snake River Water Export Bill of 1971. By the way, Senator Jordan, of all these figures that we're talking about today, had a deeper relationship with that Hells Canyon than anyone. He and his wife Grace had lived and ranched in the canyon for many years back in the 1930s. Their old homestead, if you haven't floated the river, is still standing there in the canyon. And Grace, who there's a conference room named after her here at Boise State's student union building, Grace Jordan wrote the best-selling book Home Below Hells Canyon about their time there. To head off Packwood's in run and competing legislation, Church rounded up support from Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, a Republican, and Washington Democratic Senators Henry Jackson and Warren Magnuson. Together, these four senators had tremendous power in Washington, D.C. at the time. And then in 1972, Lynn Jordan retired, and as Mike and Karl said, Congressman Jim McClure was elected to replace him in the United States Senate, and that kind of changed the equation. Just a word about Senator McClure. Throughout his life, he too had a special relationship with Hells Canyon and the surrounding Seven Devils Mountains. As a boy, McClure's father, Will, who was a lawyer living in Council at the time, told his son how he once hiked into Hells Canyon to meet with one of his clients. And that was a story that Senator McClure always remembered. Senator McClure himself had hiked and camped in the Seven Devils many times because coming from Payette, literally the canyon was in his backyard. At first, McClure was pretty private about his views on whether to save the canyon or not. But privately, he did favor preservation, according to his biographer, William Smallwood. But when he surveyed his constituents, it was very clear that they favored preservation as well. And he became a much more outspoken proponent and signed on to the legislation that eventually would preserve the canyon. McClure's support, I think, was extremely critical to the passage of the legislation because Idaho's 1st District Congressman, Steve Sims, and 2nd District Congressman George Hansen were dead set against it. So the bill had so McClure's support gave it some bipartisan support. Now the bill had support from both Oregon's Republican senators and Idaho's 2 senators, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. But it also had support from 3 very important leaders. Oregon Governor Tom Karl, Washington Republican Governor Dan Evans, and of course, Idaho's Democratic Governor Cecil Andrus. These 3 men came from very different parties, but they had a deep and close relationship. One of the things that these 3 men had in common was an abiding love for the outdoors. They loved to hunt, they loved to fish, they loved to hike. In fact, Governor Evans, well into his 80s, was hiking in the Cascade Mountains. They were such good friends that the press dubbed them the 3 Musketeers. Andrus, McCall, and Evans met quarterly in person to discuss the issues that affected all 3 states. I interviewed Evans several times for a book I started working on before he died last year. And he told me that the 3 not only met quarterly, but they were always talking on the phone and sometimes weekly. One of the issues that Governor Andrus and Evans and McCall discussed often was the preservation of Hell's Canyon. And in 1971, the 3 governors of the states signed a letter to the Federal Power Commission urging them not to approve of a new dam in Hell's Canyon. And that support was very important to getting the legislation passed. After the legislation did pass Congress, President Jerry Ford had to decide whether to sign it or veto it. He was getting a lot of pressure from the private power industry people to veto it so that they could build a dam there. But some of the people knowledgeable about the power issue said that a new dam would not produce that much power in the long term. One of his aides, Jim Cannon, wrote a memo to Ford explaining his options, whether to veto the bill or to sign it. In that memo, he told Ford that Hell's Canyon bill had bipartisan support and listed in particular that Republican Senators Packwood, McClure, and Hatfield supported the bill, as well as the bill's sponsor, Frank Church, who was thinking about running for president and planning to in the following year, just like Ford. Knowing that these influential Republican senators like McClure, Packwood, and Hatfield supported the bill, gave Ford the confidence to sign it, and their support offset the opposition from Sims and Hansen. Writing about the creation of the Hell's Canyon Recreation Area at the time, the Lewiston Morning Tribune wrote, credits for establishing recreation area for Hell's Canyon must go, of course, to the early day environmentalists whose foresight delayed further power company designs on already concrete chokes in the river. Then the Tribune praised Senators Bob Packwood and Frank Church for sponsoring the bill. But the Tribune, which was a Democratic-leaning paper and wasn't always very supportive of Senator McClure, saved the last praise for him. The paper wrote, but the highest tribute should be reserved for Idaho Senator James McClure, whose pro-recreation stand placed him at odds with many of his fellow conservatives and those segments of industry from whom he receives much of his campaign support. McClure placed the welfare of future generations over political expediency. He deserves recognition, a gold star for Senator McClure, end quote. My last point is this. If a major cross-border issue arose today, it would be a challenge that challenge the status quo, I think it would be very difficult for the political leaders of the Pacific Northwest to find the same bipartisanship that they had 50 years ago. They don't have the deep personal relationships that could serve as the foundation for collaboration. That's because over the past 50 years, the states have diverged from their political warnings that they had 50 years ago. Both politically and culturally, they have become more polarized, just as other states around the country have in their regions. Oregon was once a dominant Republican state, hard to believe today, when there were such things as liberal Republicans like Tom McCall and Bob Pathwood and Mark Hatfield. Washington, which was a purple state 50 years ago with a liberal Republican governor and two powerful Democratic senators, is essentially a blue state now with enclaves of congressional Republicans, mainly in the East. And 50 years ago, Idaho had a Democratic governor, Cecil Andrus, a Democratic senator, Frank Church, and several Democratic state office holders, and a more balanced role in the legislature. Today, Idaho is one of the most conservative one-party states in the country, and Idaho has not elected a statewide Democrat to office since Cecil Andrus retired in 1994. The deep bipartisanships, especially among the three governors of our states, is virtually now non-existent. That does not bode well for the people of the Pacific Northwest if we face another major issue like Hell's Canyon in the near future. The good news is that 50 years ago, visionary leaders of both parties with deep and abiding friendships and relationships saved the day. Generations of our citizens of the great Pacific Northwest, this corner of the country, owe a great deal to these leaders 50 years ago. Thank you.
I hope you're busy writing questions on the cards. Just raise your card up and someone will bring them to me. As we're waiting for those questions to come forward, I'd like to ask the panel to talk about why a national recreation area, why that mechanism, why not another mechanism? What was special about that designation?
What was special about the national recreation designation? Well, they choose it. It was also kind of built on the model of the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. There's a lot of talk about over the years, dating back to the 1930s, about the Sawtooths becoming a national park, but there's a lot of opposition by Idahoans to that concept. It would bring in too many outsiders, I think. And so the same held true for Hell's Canyon. There was a lot of talk about that being a national park. In fact, Frank Church supported that at one point. But when everybody went kind of crazy with the idea of that being a national park, he sort of retreated from that idea. And I think because the multiple use, the chance that people can still fish and hunt there and ranch there, as well as use the river, fit the culture of Idaho better than, say, a national park or a complete wilderness area.
I just might add that McClure was not only with Sawtooth and Hell's Canyon, but when the City Rocks was being discussed, people then at that time were talking about national parks as well, designation. And it's the multiple use. He did not feel like, he just felt like it was too restrictive and he didn't want to exclude other users of the public lands that were already using those areas. So that's another part.
Let me add one other point too, and this traces back into the first controversy. You have to remember the political and economic and cultural clout of irrigators in the Snake Basin. The management of the Snake River, that working river, which is a phrase that all Idaho politicians learned from the cradle, the working Snake River, still mattered in the early 70s. The idea of a national park threatened the control through prior appropriation and state management of water that irrigators have earned and enjoyed over the last century or more. I think that water is especially the role of irrigation in creating the kind of snake basin we have now, was a third rail that nobody was willing to touch politically.
Thank you very much. Question from the audience: was the moratorium legislation proposed to make it possible to protect Hells Canyon for the long term, or just to buy time and make the issue go away?
Well, it was really just about time. And these two leaders, Jordan and Church, felt like over time, they each thought their constituency would demand a dam there or stop a dam there. As it turned out, I think Senator Church was very wise and foresighted and knew time was on his side because, you know, in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, the environmental movement sort of was reaching a higher level. Recreation was being demanded. That's where we got the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and the Salmon River. And so I think Church was very farsighted in seeing that eventually recreation would take the greater demand.
Everything Rod said, I completely agree with, as I do almost always when I hear him talk about Idaho politics. It's a resource you guys need to pay attention to. I think, again, though, water was an issue that was especially uppermost in Senator Jordan's mind. This was the point when California was surfacing some pretty outlandish but potentially feasible techniques to try to tap into the Snake River. And I think that Senator Jordan thought a moratorium would be one way of signaling that Idahoans were going to decide what happened to the Middle Snake River, that California needed to butt out. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about, but California had ideas kicking around, and there were federal agencies with plans on the board that would have permitted California to move Snake River water down across Nevada into California. As outlandish as it seems, that was a huge red flag that you could wave in Idaho to motivate people.
Were you trying to pull your slide back up with that
Yeah.
photo? Yeah. I don't know if we can get his slides back, but he has a really great photo of Senator Church with the schematic.
Right. It looks like a briefing in the Cold War. It shows Idaho and it shows pipes coming from California. And he's showing Senator Henry Jackson of Washington what would happen if California tapped Idaho's water. And they both look alarmed by that prospect.
So we'll see if we can get
Right
that back
there.
up.
That's
Yep,
it.
there you go.
See, it looks like something from a Cold War briefing. As it was in Idaho, water is worth fighting for in Idaho, folks.
I might add too that in as much as I mostly worked with natural resource agencies during my time with the senator, even afterwards, I went to many Committee of 9 meetings up in the Upper Snake, all the other irrigators in the state, and I just want to reaffirm that what Karl said is true. Water was the issue. Being a farm kid myself, and having a great grandfather that homesteaded, a grandfather that homesteaded, and a father that did desert land entry, it was all about water from the Snake River. So that was a very critical part of the whole discussion in Hells Canyon.
Water got a lot of politicians elected.
Yeah. And stopped other careers before they started.
And when you cross the Salmon River, it's less so, but down here, it's like lifeblood. It would be a desert without it.
Yeah, there were a lot of letters about irrigation in the McClure papers. It's really interesting. So there are several questions about collaboration, and the questions really focus on what we might need to do today or looking forward. But I actually want to pull this question back around collaboration and bipartisanship. Rod, you touched on this a lot about what was special in these relationships. But can you say more, each of you say more about, build on your remarks and talk about like, how did these relationships form? Or if they weren't formed, how did they kind of make them on the spot? How did they nurture them? What did that look like?
This was I call the relationship between Andrus, McClure, and Evans the golden age of governors. These guys were amazing. They, and I had the privilege of even covering them when they all three met here in Idaho. They had this immediate bond, and I think they bonded because of the kind of people they were, the kind of personalities they had, and because they loved the outdoors. McClure, McCall and Andrus were hunters and anglers. Evans was a hiker. He climbed Mount Rainier when he was governor of Washington. Didn't even tell the press he was doing that. And then you have Idaho, where you had Senator Church and Senator McClure. They did have a lot of differences, especially in 1980 when that relationship. I covered the Senate race between Church and Sims, and that relationship between Church and McClure kind of broke down during that campaign. But then McClure, Church sponsored the River No Return Wilderness, and McClure, which I think was one of the most decent things I've ever seen in politics, passed legislation to name that Praying Church River No Return Wilderness. And of course, McClure and as Mike said, McClure and Andrus had this really close relationship. They worked on so many land issues together. I mentioned the 1988 agreement. They literally got down on their knees and they were writing, we're going to put this in wilderness, we're going to free this up for multiple use logging and other things. They literally did that. And of course, one of the reasons when I was editorial page of the Statesman that we endorsed it was that, having them come together and collaborate on this gave us great confidence that it was a pretty solid plan. But of course, the environmentalists sort of ate it alive because McClure was a co-sponsor, and then the industry was suspicious because Andrus was a co-sponsor. So the thing never went anywhere. It's one of those, good intentions. You get punished for good intentions.
Quick comment. All the attention we give on these great folks, great men in this case, it's appropriate. But I want to call out and throw some props to staff munchkins. All of these people we're talking about had super staff members, and they worked their butts off with each other and with other offices. That's something that, I was in DC for a couple of years with EPA. Watching the way that congressional staff now staff their representative or their senator and interact with federal agencies and interest groups, it's a world apart, and it's not a good world. The kind of staff trust and respect and the patience that they put into, these bills don't come out of nowhere. There's hours and hours of staff meeting. And speaking from the church side of things, we really respected guys like Mike and the people over in that office. And I think that the bosses did too, and put a lot of responsibility on the staff to put language together to reflect the big objectives that they were aiming at. And that was something that really made a difference as staff work. Sure, more about staff.
Yeah, like just what both of you, Mike and Karl, what it looked like, what was happening behind the
If you
scenes.
dig into the archives that lead up to the enactment of the National Recreation Area, it is filled with committee hearings and both in DC and field hearings. Committee hearings don't happen without massive amounts of staff work, preparing an agenda, helping the member get ready for the hearing, soliciting input from interests that want to come in and talk, balancing the time, then digesting it, summarizing it, saying, here are a couple of options that we see coming out of this, congressman or senator or something like that. Then a lot of the negotiation, the stuff that doesn't get the media, it's staff members talking to each other on the phone or buying a beer for each other and saying, okay, if we were to work with X and Y on this, do you think Z and A could be brought around to do this? And again, watching it from a staff level, there was a huge amount of high quality staff work being done by people in many cases who may even be in this room, I don't know. But they deserve a lot of the credit for doing the heavy lifting and the kind of just nuts and bolts negotiating that goes into writing a piece of congressional legislation. Not to mention the next 50 years of making it all work.
I was a gopher in DC, so I didn't do much in DC when I was there. I came out in '76 with the Teton Dam disaster, actually, and worked a lot with George Klein from the church campaign, from the church office, who was actually from Western Idaho, but because of the intensity of that disaster, there just needed to be bodies on the ground. That's why I always sent from DC back to the state. But we would work with Senator Church's office, Randy Furness out of Hotel. I worked with him all the time. Congressman George Hansen at the time, he was a bit of a character, but we worked with his staff. We were going to the same meetings. Sometimes we didn't write together.
And it just gave you the opportunity to kind of collaborate, because I think it comes from the bosses down. We did it because that's what our bosses expected us to do. And it was great training. And it's what I tried to do the rest of my career in government. It really is, it really came from the bosses, the senators and the governors. They're the ones that decide whether or not their people are going to work together.
One other quick point too, I've seen it again from the church side. People were hired for their knowledge and their credibility and their expertise. Rarely were they hired because they were political activists or bomb throwers, college Democrats or Republicans. The people I had the privilege of working around in church's office and seeing work from the other congressional offices, they knew they knew their shit. They knew the water law, they knew the land law, they knew the federal agencies, they knew what other people knew that they didn't know, and they knew how to find them. Just a tremendous level of staff expertise. It was impressive, really impressive to watch.
Thank you. So this is sort of an imagination question. I assume Andrus, Church, and McClure, even Jordan, couldn't be elected in today's political environment. If they could they collaborate on issues like the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area? So maybe thinking about you touched on a little bit what's different now, but maybe a different way to think about this, since you're sort of the history panel, is like other aspects of what was special about this collaboration, maybe relationships with constituents or with the media.
Back in those days, it was a world different. I mean, the world we're living in today couldn't be more opposite than the world they lived in. And actually, all the time I covered politics. Back then, the Republican Party was much different than it is today. It was conservative, but for the most part, it was right of center conservative. The Democratic Party was obviously more liberal, but it was kind of leftist center liberal. Right? You had, in the Republican Party, you had a Tom McCall and a Dan Evans, and you had a Mark Hadfield, who partnered with Frank Church to help end the Vietnam War. They sponsored bills together in the Senate to stop the Vietnam War, and you had Packwood. In Idaho, you had McClure, who I always considered a right of center Republican. But over the last 50 years, and I don't have to tell you all of this, everything's changed. The parties are extremely polarized. The people of the United States are extremely polarized. And the politics have really shifted especially in the Republican Party, to the far right. And it's unrecognizable today. And I think that makes it very difficult, especially with the money in politics. Back in those days, people like McClure and Church and the other senators, they spent a lot of time in Washington. And there's the old saying that if you have people over for dinner, for a barbecue on Sunday, you can't demonize them on Monday. And in those days, there were Republicans and Democrats mixed. You guys don't know that. And now, they hardly, a Republican never wants to get their picture taken with a Democrat, and a Democrat never wants their picture taken with a Republican because their base will eat them up. So, I mean, it's really, really sad. And then we have politicians today who go out of their way to be partisan. They go out of their way to be partisan. And in those days, they avoided being partisan. And I think that is part of the problem too.
Could I just observe that in any kind of panel where I start something off with, well, back in those days, I'm thinking, oh my God, I've been around for a while. It seems quite remarkable. I think it would be very difficult to recreate the conditions that we three have been talking about here. I mean, the historian in me would say you can learn some things from history, but you cannot make history rewire the present. We're just not that smart. We don't have the tools, we don't have the intelligence, and things change. I mean, social structures change, economic relationships change, political rhetoric changes. It's still helpful to learn, to see what's possible, and to consider that possible solutions are out there. I'm sure people in the late 1940s and early 50s, when you were talking about socialism and the future of America, thought, We'll never come to any kind of compromise over dams in the canyon. And yet, over the course of 25, 30 years, passions cooled off a little bit. Wiser heads took over, interests got adjusted. Remember, though, some interests got adjusted and other interests were ignored altogether. It's important to recognize that up until the mid-1970s, the interests of Joseph and his people were largely ignored and marginalized by the white politicians and the white structures of power and economics that made things happen in these northwestern states. That's one way things were able to work out, is that interests at the table could deal and other interests that were harder to negotiate were kept outside the room.
I would just like to say I'm grateful that the good places in Idaho have been preserved. You know, as an Idaho, you know, I think most of the good places.
So we're lucky that way. I do agree with both. The politics on both sides have become extreme. And so it's really hard to get in the middle and compromise and work together because you're looked at as a traitor. But that said, there's still things within, for example, you know, I talked a little bit about the forest fires and range fires. One of the big concerns we had back in, you know, working with the salmon issue was timber and the destruction it had on the habitat in the freshwater habitat. I wonder, you know, is what we're doing with forest fires today, it's got to be worse than timber could ever have been. So, you know, I just think that there are areas within what we're doing that we can work on. You know, there's still regulations that are there. There are still good people in government, Forest Service, BLM, etc. There's still good people in elected officials' offices that want to make differences. I still think that, you know, maybe it won't be as large, but I think we can make those incremental things. But it takes us wanting to work together to solve the issue, not just with the fight.
So we're going to do one last question, and there are several that came forward, and I think that they're better suited for other panels. I'm going to leave them up here and make sure those moderators have those questions. But if each of you could say one thing that those here in the room, those who are in Lewiston and online and other places, one thing that each person can do to help promote collaboration and public engagement, perhaps somehow connected to the principles you pulled out here in the story about getting to an RA designation, what would that one thing be? So just really quickly, one thing.
Believe that there is a concept of public service serving the public good. I teach that now at the University of Kansas. It may sound trite, but there are a lot of people in our society today who dismiss the idea of public service, public servants, and the notion that there is a public good. Hang on to that. It's what makes this country what it is today. Once you give up that, Katie bar the door after that. So believe in public service, public servants, and the notion that there is a public good that we can work together to accomplish.
I think it's a hard question. Yeah. Collaboration is a verb. It takes people wanting to sit down together and solve the problem. And sometimes it just takes one person who wants to start that. So I think if individually we do it, have the power within ourselves to make it work, but we have to be the kind of mindset. First of all, we want to solve something. We don't want to fight. We want to figure out what's right for the resource instead of just what I want. So I guess that's what I would say.
I fundamentally believe that besides being a spouse and a parent, the most important role we have is citizen. And I think that we've lost the sense of the citizens are really we get the government we deserve. And that citizens, we have to be more serious about our role as citizens and citizenship. And that means we have to get educated. We have to get educated about the issues. We have to get educated about the economy. We have to get educated, and we have to be knowledgeable citizens. And it all begins with citizenship, because if we make the wrong decisions, the founders of our country had this, and one of the reasons I went into journalism was they had this abiding faith that if people had knowledge, they would make the right decision. And I think where we've gotten off track is that we haven't educated ourselves as citizens. and we haven't taken that seriously. And I think we need to, and that's how we can control. We have that within our control, and that's what we should do.